He sold his land, everything his family had ever owned, just to send his twin daughters to school. Then, for 20 years, he scrubbed floors and cleaned toilets to keep that dream alive. They mocked him, called him foolish, said girls would grow up, marry, and leave. But 2 decades later, they weren't leaving. They came back and brought the sky with them. Stay with us to uncover the story of a father who gave up the earth so his daughters could rise beyond it. And tell us in comments where you're watching from. Before he became the man who raised the sky, Malcolm Carter was a man of the earth. A poor black farmer in Willow Creek, Mississippi, he lived quietly, working soil passed down through 3 generations. The fields were worn, the harvest thin, but they were his. And with his wife Nia, he believed it was enough. They had planned for a son, someone to carry on the Carter name and walk behind the plow. But fate brought them something else. Nia's labor came too soon. Malcolm drove her to the county hospital in a truck that coughed smoke at every turn. She gripped his hand at the entrance and said, "If it's a boy, name him Elijah." Then the doors closed. She never came back through them. Hours later, a nurse placed 2 newborn girls into Malcolm's arms. The doctor followed with a bowed head and a quiet apology. Nia was gone. Malcolm held his daughters close, unsure how grief and awe could exist at the same time. He named them Zora and Nova and stood outside under the harsh Mississippi sun, wondering how he'd keep them alive. That same afternoon, he buried Nia beneath the oak tree at the edge of his farm. He dug the grave himself. No hymns, no visitors. Just the promise he whispered into the dirt. "I'll raise them, even if it costs me everything." That night, the babies cried for food. Malcolm had none to give. With no formula, no money, and no time, he wrapped them in his coat and walked 5 miles to town. At the edge of the road, Miss Thelma Jean, a retired midwife, opened her door. She didn't ask questions. She handed him 2 warm bottles of donor milk and said, "These babies belong to all of us now." Malcolm nodded. He didn't speak. Back home, he fed them by firelight and watched them fall asleep on the floor beside Nia's old quilt. The house was quiet, but his mind was loud. He stared at the roof, at the cracks in the walls, and at the future he could no longer see. But his vow remained. He would raise them alone. And no matter what the land took from him, he would not let the world take them. Raising 2 infants on a dying farm tested every vow Malcolm Carter had ever made. Mornings began in darkness, not with the rooster, but with hunger cries that echoed through their wooden house. With no one to guide him, Malcolm taught himself to care for Zora and Nova. He warmed rainwater to bathe them, cut old feed sacks into makeshift diapers, and slept beside their crib in stolen moments between feedings. The farm, once his pride, was fading fast. A second drought had set in. Crops refused to grow. With every passing week, the soil gave him less to live on and more reasons to let go. But Malcolm didn't yield. He bundled the girls and took them with him into the fields, cradling them between planting rows as he worked. Every blister, every skipped meal, became another act of faith. Neighbors watched in disbelief. Some laughed, others whispered pity. "No man raises daughters in dirt," they said. "It'll break him." But Malcolm never answered. He didn't need to. His silence was sharper than their doubt. Zora learned to smile first. Nova followed, louder, bolder. Their presence lit up the house like Nia's voice once had. And in those brief moments between exhaustion and uncertainty, Malcolm remembered who he was doing this for, and who he had once promised. But promise could not keep the farm running. Equipment broke, debts rose, and late one night, after feeding the girls the last of the formula, Malcolm stood over the kitchen table, staring down at unpaid bills that blurred beneath his tired eyes. He didn't speak. He simply picked up a pen, crossed out the payment dates, and whispered to no one, "Not yet." He still had time, but not much. When the girls turned 5, school became the next mountain. Enrollment alone required more than Malcolm made in a month, and that didn't include uniforms, books, or transport. The farm's output had collapsed. He was barely surviving, let alone saving. He considered taking on extra work, but the town offered little. He thought briefly about remarrying, if only to have someone help raise the girls. Companionship was never his desire. He wanted safety for them, stability. That's when Vanessa entered their lives. She was a widow, recently relocated to the county. Soft-spoken and warm with the girls, she praised Malcolm's strength and patience, often bringing homemade pies or offering to watch Zora and Nova while he worked. The attention, though unfamiliar, was comforting. After months of caution, Malcolm allowed himself to believe this could work. They married beneath the sycamore tree behind the farmhouse. The girls wore yellow ribbons in their hair. For a short time, the house was full of sound again: baking, laughter, lullabies, and two voices. Malcolm dared to believe the tide was turning. Then, one humid afternoon, he returned from mending a neighbor's fence and heard screaming. He rushed inside. Vanessa towered over the twins, belt in hand, a shattered pitcher on the floor. "Ungrateful little girls," she yelled. "You ruined everything." Zora was shielding Nova, trembling. Malcolm stepped forward, voice low but absolute. "Touch them again and you'll answer to me and to God." Vanessa didn't argue. She packed her things before dawn and left without a word. That night the house was silent again, but it wasn't grief that filled the air. It was resolve. Malcolm sat beside their bed and made the vow a second time, this time not to Nia, not to the land, but directly to his daughters. "No one else will gamble with your safety, not while I'm breathing." From that day forward, there would be no more backups, no shortcuts. Malcolm was all they had, and all they would ever need. Malcolm threw himself into work and parenting with the kind of focus only loss can sharpen. But the land was slipping away faster than he could hold it. What little yield remained barely covered their meals, let alone school costs. Equipment repairs piled up, seed loans went unpaid. His tools rusted in silence. Still, he showed up every morning at the break of day, Zora and Nova bundled in scarves, watching him from the porch as he worked. They knew by then that their father didn't ask for help, didn't complain, and didn't break. Not in front of them. By second grade, the twins were showing signs of brilliance. Zora was quiet but obsessed with patterns, weather maps, cloud shapes, even the way pencils lined up on the table. Nova took apart old radios and fans from the junk pile behind the barn and tried to make them work again. Malcolm encouraged it, even when it meant sweeping up pieces of wires after dinner. But promise wasn't enough to pay for uniforms or textbooks. The land was no longer producing anything but exhaustion. And when the well dried out for the second time in a single year, Malcolm knew the truth he had been trying to deny. He could not save the farm and save his daughters at the same time. One night, after putting the girls to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the fields through the cracked glass of the back window. For 3 generations, this land had held the Carter name. It had buried his father. It had cradled Nia. It had fed him. But it would not carry Zora and Nova where they needed to go. So he made the hardest decision of his life. He sold it. Every acre, every fence post, every row. Neighbors called him reckless. Some laughed. Others shook their heads in quiet disapproval. "You'll regret it," one said. "Girls leave, sons stay." But Malcolm wasn't looking for their approval. He was looking at 2 little girls in the back seat of a borrowed pickup truck, holding each other's hands while everything they had ever known disappeared behind them. They moved into a small, cracked duplex behind the Atlanta Public Library, just a short walk from a city-run magnet school. And Malcolm, the man who had once owned 30 acres of land, started sweeping floors before sunrise for minimum wage. He didn't complain. He didn't explain. He simply got to work. Atlanta moved fast, but Malcolm Carter never missed a beat. Each morning, before the city blinked awake, he swept the marble corridors of the public library. The pay was modest, the hours long, but the building was quiet, and in that silence, he found a kind of peace. Books didn't sneer, floors didn't judge, and every dollar earned helped keep Zora and Nova one step closer to the dream he was still too afraid to say out loud. Mrs. Dolores Hartley, the head librarian, took notice. She saw how carefully Malcolm polished every surface, how he never sat, how he never asked for more. She started slipping used textbooks into the girls' school bags. A science manual here, an engineering workbook there. She never said a word about it, and neither did Malcolm. But he always nodded when she passed, and she always nodded back. The twins adjusted quickly to their new life. Their uniforms were secondhand. Their lunches were packed in reused containers. But their minds were sharp, and their hunger wasn't for food, it was for knowledge. Zora, methodical and observant, devoured books on meteorology and flight paths. She spent hours tracing clouds in the sky and matching them to what she'd read. Nova, bold and mechanical, took apart broken alarm clocks, old remotes, and anything else she could find that ticked or sparked. She built makeshift engines from junk drawer parts and said things like, "This one's gonna sing." On weekends, they walked to the airport fence and watched planes lift into the sky. One afternoon, Nova asked, "Papa, What makes them stay up there? Malcolm looked out at the tarmac, then back at his daughters, their eyes filled with light. They don't stay, he said. They rise. Zora whispered, one day, I'll fly one. Nova added, one day, I'll build one. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of engines and thunder, Malcolm said the words he'd been carrying since Willow Creek. Then, we'll do whatever it takes. But whatever it took came with a price. Library wages weren't enough to cover school trips, new shoes, or rising city rent. So Malcolm took a second job, cleaning medical offices at night. He worked through weekends, skipped meals. His knees ached, his back stiffened. But he never let the girls see it. Zora and Nova noticed anyway. Without telling him, they found ways to help. They tutored classmates after school, cleaned porches for neighbors, bagged groceries at a nearby corner store. They saved their earnings in a chipped glass jar labeled Sky Fund, and at night, they spooned leftovers into a thermos to bring home for him. Malcolm never asked where the food came from. He just smiled and said thank you, then tucked them into bed like he always had. He was holding it all together. But dreams, even the most beautiful ones, come at a cost. One rainy Thursday evening, while buffing the marble floor of a downtown law office, Malcolm's vision blurred. He felt a sudden pull in his chest, a heat behind his eyes, and then nothing. The machine jerked from his hand. His knees buckled. He collapsed to the floor, breath shallow, face against the tile he had just polished to shine. A security guard found him minutes later, motionless beside the buffer. An ambulance came. The lights flashed blue and white through the city rain. By the time Zora and Nova arrived at the hospital, their father was hooked to monitors, oxygen lines tracing his face. The doctor's tone was careful but clear. Exhaustion, malnutrition, hypertension. This didn't happen overnight. Zora covered her mouth. Nova clenched her fists. They had known he was tired, but not this tired. They had known he was struggling, but not like this. Malcolm opened his eyes just long enough to whisper, "Did I miss work?" Mrs. Dolores Hartley didn't wait for permission. She launched a fundraiser the very next morning, one email, one post, one call at a time. The story spread quickly. A father who swept library floors by day and medical offices by night, all so his daughters could reach the sky. Professors donated. Church members gave. Even strangers who had passed him in quiet hallways sent what they could. Within days, the hospital bills were covered. Rent for the next several months was secured. A second-hand reclining chair arrived, along with groceries, and even a new coat. The girls placed the donations in neat stacks beside his hospital bed. When Malcolm finally sat up and saw it all, he asked, "Where'd this come from?" Nova said, "From the people who saw you when you thought no one did." Zora added softly, "We'll take it from here. You rest." But Malcolm shook his head, a faint smile on his face. "No, I'll still walk beside you. I just might walk a little slower now." Malcolm Carter returned home from the hospital slower, but not smaller. The apartment was modest, 2 rooms behind the library, but it held warmth now. Zora and Nova had arranged everything with care. They prepared his meals in batches, laid out his medicine beside folded towels, and hung a small photo of Nia beside his chair. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for the first time in years, Malcolm allowed himself to rest without guilt. The girls, meanwhile, were rising fast. Zora's quiet diligence caught the attention of her physics teacher, who recommended her for a regional symposium on aviation. There, during a workshop on cockpit design, she asked a question about instrument layout that silenced the room. A visiting airline captain pulled her aside afterward. "Have you ever flown a simulator?" She hadn't, but he offered her access to one. Nova entered an engineering competition hosted by Aeroglide Systems, a company working on sustainable flight components. Her submission, an adjustable, low-cost winglet design built from recycled materials, won second place. But her interview with the judges impressed them more than her prototype. "We see something in you," they said. "How would you like a summer internship?" By the time senior year rolled around, both girls had partial scholarships to programs they had only ever read about. Zora was accepted into Liberty Sky's first officer trainee program. Nova received an offer to join Aeroglide's mechanical engineering mentorship track. But tuition still stretched far beyond what any grant could cover. So they worked harder. They cleaned dorm kitchens in the evenings, took weekend jobs walking dogs and assisting elderly neighbors. Malcolm tried to stop them, but they refused. "This isn't just your fight anymore," Zora told him. It's ours. One morning, as the sun spilled into the living room, Malcolm opened the rusted tin box beneath his bed. Inside were the last few bills he had saved, Nia's ring, and a folded copy of the deed to land he no longer owned. He laid it all on the table. "It's not much," he said, "but it's yours." The girls didn't cry. They simply nodded, hands over his, steady as the vow he had once made. Graduation day arrived under a sky so clear, it felt like the heavens were holding their breath. Malcolm Carter woke early, his hands steady, his heart loud. This was not just a ceremony. This was a vow being fulfilled. At the university stadium, families cheered. Names echoed across the loudspeakers. Malcolm found his seat near the front and gripped the edge of his chair like a man holding onto the last piece of a storm-tossed raft. Then they called her name, Zora Carter, first officer trainee, Liberty Sky. Malcolm shot up to his feet and cupped his hands around his mouth. "That's my pilot!" The audience laughed softly. Some turned to look. Zora looked too, right at him, and smiled so wide it reached all the way back to Willow Creek. Then came the next name, Nova Carter, mechanical engineering honors graduate, Aeroglide Systems intern. Malcolm didn't wait. "That's my engineer," he cried, voice full, proud, and unashamed. People clapped louder this time. Camera swiveled toward him, and as Nova crossed the stage, tassel swinging, she paused, turned, and blew her father a kiss. She didn't need the microphone. Everyone in the room knew who she belonged to. After the ceremony, reporters swarmed. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter," one of them called out, pushing through the crowd. A woman in a blazer held out a mic, her voice too rehearsed to sound kind. "What kept you going through all of this?" Malcolm adjusted his jacket and answered without blinking. "A promise, to their mother and to the sky." The clip would later go viral. But when the media turned to the twins, asking for exclusives and photo ops, Zora simply shook her head. "We're not here for headlines." Nova added, "We'd rather build something that lasts than become a story that They declined interviews, declined offers, not out of shyness, but out of principle. This wasn't about fame. It was about the man who gave up everything so they could touch skies. Later that evening, they took their father by the hand and led him down a quiet garden path behind campus. Around the bend stood a modest cream-colored house, tucked beneath a line of trees. A brass plaque on the front door read, "Carter House, because you gave us ground to rise." Malcolm stood frozen. "This for me?" Zora nodded, eyes wet. Nova opened the door and whispered, "We've been saving since first year." Inside, the walls told their story. Framed report cards, flight sim photos, prototype sketches, a portrait of Nia in the center of it all. Below it sat Malcolm's toolbox, polished and placed beside a copy of the land deed he once gave up without hesitation. He lowered himself into the chair they had saved up to buy, the kind that reclined, the kind that felt permanent. And for the first time in 20 years, he let go of the weight he had carried. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because every breath in that room whispered back the same truth. He kept the promise, and they made it fly. But they weren't done. A few months later, Zora and Nova took Malcolm back to Willow Creek, not to visit, but to plant something new in the soil that once tried to bury them. This time, they weren't carrying boxes or suitcases. They carried blueprints, permits, and a vision that bore their mother's name. With help from their salaries, employer sponsorships, and donations still coming in from across the country, they broke ground on the NIA Carter Center for Girls and Rural Health. It would be the first of its kind in their county. Malcolm stood quietly at the edge of the lot on day one of construction. The land was dry, but his chest felt full. Someone asked if he'd say a few words. He just nodded and said, "Make space. Some of these girls will outgrow it faster than you think." Zora taught free aviation workshops on Saturdays under a tree near the new school wing. Nova helped design the clean water system and solar grid, checking each plan twice. They didn't want to just give back. They wanted to change what it meant to grow up here. On opening day, the entire town showed up. Children ran through the halls holding paper airplanes. A gospel choir sang beneath a banner with Nia's name. Skyway Airlines sent a jet for a flyover in Zora's honor. When the roar passed overhead, Malcolm looked up and smiled, not with surprise, but with recognition. He had seen this coming all along. Standing between his daughters at the ribbon, cane in hand, he said into the mic, "Folks told me investing in girls was a waste. Said they'd leave, but my daughters, they came back. And they brought the sky with them." That clip aired across the country. But the girls, as always, turned attention away from themselves. They honored Miss Thelma Jean, who once gave them milk when all he had was hope, Mrs. Hartley, who slipped textbooks into backpacks without asking. Every early helper was named and thanked with a hand-carved plaque and a front-row seat. "We didn't get here alone," Zora said. "And we're not leaving anyone behind," Nova added. And for the first time in its history, Willow Creek saw daughters return, not just to visit, but to change everything. The center flourished. Enrollment grew. Health outcomes rose. And for the first time in Willow Creek's history, young girls walked into classrooms named after a woman who once died giving birth to hope. Malcolm spent his mornings on the porch of Carter House, sipping coffee and watching buses roll past the same road he once walked alone. He no longer needed to work, but he stayed involved, quietly, steadily, present. Then, one afternoon, a familiar figure appeared at the front desk. Vanessa. Time had not been kind to her. She looked thinner, unsure of where to stand. Her second husband had gambled away their savings. She was looking for work. She didn't recognize most faces. And no one recognized her, until she saw Malcolm walk into the hallway. He didn't call security. He didn't turn away. He offered her a chair. He poured the tea himself. She stared into the cup for a long time before whispering, "I broke them. I broke what you built. I was cruel, and I can't undo it." Malcolm studied her like a man measuring a storm before deciding whether to plant again. Then he said quietly, "Not everything broken stays broken, but that choice isn't mine. It's yours." He gave her a part-time clerical position, under oversight, with clear lines, not because he forgot, not because he owed her, but because his legacy would never be built on punishment. It would be built on what he planted, even if the ground had once been hard. That night, he told the girls. Nova's fists curled. Zora looked out the window, long and quiet. Then she said, "Mercy isn't weakness, and forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but maybe it's how we stay free." The next morning, no one mentioned it again. Vanessa did her work, quietly, gratefully. The girls didn't speak to her much. They didn't have to. She knew what it meant to be allowed back in, even through the side door. And Malcolm? He returned to his porch. Because a man who gave his land so his daughters could touch skies had no interest in holding grudges that could keep them grounded. 20 years after its founding, the NIA Carter Center stood taller than its walls. Girls had become scholars, nurses, engineers, and dreamers, unafraid of the sky. At the anniversary celebration, Malcolm, now older, slower, sat near the front with his cane across his lap. His daughter stood beside him, their stories etched into every brick. Then a little girl stepped forward, her braids swinging, eyes full of fire. She tugged his sleeve and said, "Sir, I want to help Captain Zora." Malcolm smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then aim higher than she did, baby girl." Cameras flashed. Applause rose. But inside that moment was something more. A legacy that no longer needed to be spoken to be believed. If one man with nothing can raise daughters who lift nations, what could we change if we all believed in everyone around us? Let us know in the comments. Who would you raise to touch the sky? If this story moved you, please subscribe to hear more voices that matter, more journeys that inspire, and more truths that rise from humble ground. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.